have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Those are words from the famous speech, I Have a Dream, that was delivered by Martin Luther King Jr. That speech changed America. By the time of his death in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. had already left a lasting impact on Americans. Martin Luther King Jr. was an exceptional humanitarian. I will describe him in three main points. First, Martin Luther King Jr. was a follower of God who did not believe in violence. Second, Martin Luther King Jr. was a leader of the civil rights movement. And third, Martin Luther King Jr. led by example. From the day he was born until the day he died, Martin Luther King Jr. had a love for God that could not be broken. And he never once took part in any act of violence. Which brings me to my first main point. Martin Luther King Jr. was a follower of God who did not believe in violence. According to the official biography website republished at the beginning of this year, stated that Martin Luther King Jr. was born into a family that was raised in church. His father and his grandfather were both ministers, which of course they wanted him to follow that path. However, he wanted to be something different, until one day his college professor changed his mind. According to the King Center official website, which was established in 1968 by Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s wife, to honor her husband, saying he was unlike many. He did not resort to violence. He knew that violence solved nothing. The only thing that came out of violence was more hurt, more pain, and more violence. Being a black man at this time, he knew that hurt was not a good feeling and did not want people to feel that way. So he used the power of words and the act of nonviolence to make a movement. In my first main point, I stated how Martin Luther King Jr. had a love for God and for nonviolence. Martin Luther King Jr.'s view on nonviolence made him a great candidate for a leader. Which leads me to my second main point. Martin Luther King Jr. was a leader of the civil rights movement. According to the Stanford University Encyclopedia webpage, the Montgomery bus boycott was a large movement. It began with the arrest of Rosa Parks on December 1st, 1955. She refused to give up her seat to a white man, which landed her in jail. Martin Luther King Jr. decided he was going to take a stand for his people. The 5th of December, 90% of the blacks stayed off of the bus systems. They met that night only to be voted that they were going to continue the bus boycott. The bus boycott lasted 13 long months. It ended on December 20th, 1956, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the bus segregation was unconstitutional. According to the same Stanford Encyclopedia website, Martin Luther King Jr. led the March on Washington. On August 28, 1963, 200,000 people marched in the March on Washington. That day is where Martin Luther King Jr. galvanized the nation with his I Have a Dream speech. As I stated in my second main point, Martin Luther King Jr. was a leader, which brings me to my third and final main point. Martin Luther King Jr. led by an example. According to the official Nobel Peace Prize, republished at the beginning of every year, Martin Luther King Jr. led by such a great example that he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. At the time of his acceptance, he was the youngest person to accept a Nobel Peace Prize. And instead of keeping the money for himself, he decided that he was going to donate it to the civil rights movement. In 1995 article published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Religion of Ethics, they described Martin Luther King Jr. as a one-of-a-kind. He was the first non-president to have a memorial. There have been streets all over the world changed just to honor him, and there are also museums all over the place. He is the only non president to have a national holiday. As I stated in my third and final main point, Martin Luther King Jr. led by example. When we think of a national holiday, we think of a president. However, Martin Luther King Jr. was never a president. But when we think of someone who changed America, he does come to mind. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. Martin Luther King Jr. just wanted everybody to be treated equally. And he knew that he was going to do whatever possible to make that happen, even if it meant dying for what he believed in. Martin Luther King Jr. was an exceptional humanitarian and will be remembered because, one, he was a follower of God who did not believe in violence. Two, he was a leader of the civil rights movement. And three, Martin Luther King Jr. led by an example.